If you struggle with depression, the chances are that you know exactly what I mean when I say that shutting down is a common theme within depression. My name is Terry Lynch. I'm a physician, psychotherapist, best-selling mental health author, mental health educator, and the provider of a recovery-oriented mental health service. I've been working with people with depression for over 20 years now. I've been a medical doctor for 35 years, and I've been specialising in mental health for over 20 years. I spend about 10 hours a week with people diagnosed with and suffering with depression. My particular interest and specialty is the emotional and psychological aspects of mental health, in particular the various psychiatric diagnoses, including depression. I have found over the years that seeking and finding deeper understandings of the emotional and psychological aspects of depression can provide us with pathways towards recovery. Putting this simply, the better we understand something, the more equipped we can become to address it. In this presentation, I'm setting out an explanation for shutting down in depression, an explanation as to why it's such a common practice employed by people who are struggling with depression. Shutting down in depression, as I've said, is very common, and yet you don't hear too many explanations for it, other than, well, it's part of depression. And I think we need to understand shutting down and other aspects of depression more deeply, more comprehensively, for us to be able to construct pathways towards recovery. If you struggle with depression, it is very likely that you are familiar with shutting down as a regular feature of depression. The typical medical explanation, and I say this as a medical doctor with 35 years experience, is that this shutting down is a symptom of depression as a medical illness. The typical medical explanation doesn't generally go into more detail than this. Therefore, according to this explanation, you treat the shutting down by treating the medical illness referred to as depression. And the assumption is made that all symptoms, including shutdown, will be correspondingly treated by treating depression. This approach works for some people, and one can see the logic of it. But there are several problems and several limitations within this approach. The current medical approach to depression underestimates the frequency and the significance, to which I would add, as I'll discuss later in this presentation, the purpose of shutdown in depression. For example, shutting down is not mentioned within the official 9 depression criteria. Shutting down is not referred to in any way within these criteria, and yet shutting down is a generally present feature within depression, as you most likely are all too aware if you struggle with depression. Within the current medical approach to depression, a significant error of judgment is regularly made in relation to shutting down in depression, interpreting this, or perhaps more accurately, misinterpreting this as totally part of the problem of the person's depression. This starting point is diametrically opposite to what is actually going on for and within the person, as we will see as we go through this presentation. Quite the contrary. In fact, shutting down has generally become a trusted solution in the eyes of the person, as we will discuss within this presentation. How might shutting down be a part of a person's solution in depression? Features of depression that occur very commonly within depression, that rarely get adequately noticed or dealt with, are powerlessness, an inner felt sense of powerlessness, feeling powerless in the world, feeling under threat, feeling at the mercy of, feeling generally unsafe, unprotected, without defences in the world. These and other related common experiences lead to the regular experiencing or the fear of impending overwhelm. If you have been struggling with depression, I imagine you know exactly what I mean. Overwhelm is such a common feature within depression, so painful, so difficult, yet you rarely hear it mentioned in relation to depression. In depression, shutting down is a way of coping with perceived or experienced overwhelm, a recurring problem, a recurring threat for the majority of people who struggle with depression. Indeed, shutting down commonly becomes a trusted and therefore a regularly employed self-protective strategy, a purposeful strategy, because it serves a purpose. One of the main purposes being the minimizing and the avoiding of overwhelm. How and why does shutting down work? I've put works in inverted commas here, because as we will see now as we go through this presentation, yes, shutting down does work to a degree, but it can cause, and generally does cause, a whole range of other problems, other stresses. How is shutting down purposeful? What problem is shutting down regularly employed to solve? For what problem is shutting down seen within depression as an effective solution? Many people struggling with depression regularly employ shutting down as a tried and trusted intervention, in other words, a solution, to overwhelm, to both the experience of overwhelm, which is, as the term suggests, overwhelming, and the very anticipation or the possibility of experiencing overwhelm. Such is the literally overwhelming nature of the experience of overwhelm. And this is the problem within depression shutting down is so regularly employed to solve. This makes sense when you think about it. My starting point always in my work is first to seek to make sense of a person's experiences and behaviours. That then provides a very good platform from which to initiate recovery-oriented work. Why shutting down is such a commonly chosen solution in depression? Core emotional and psychological aspects of depression include woundedness, a wounded sense of self, resulting in considerable self-compromise, by which I mean that when we've had a great deal of wounding, we generally feel we have to compromise ourselves, limit ourselves in many ways in the world in order to get by, to survive. For example, compromising our expression, which is partially why reduced self-expression is such a common feature of depression. There can be much compromise around our needs, and we can become risk-averse, by which I mean that within depression, the avoidance of risk frequently becomes a significant priority. I won't be able to go into all of these issues within this presentation. I do go into them all and more within my course, Understanding and Recovering from Depression. At the end of this presentation, I will include more information about this course. Another very common core emotional and psychological aspect of depression is the person's inner felt sense of being safe in the world, is generally greatly reduced, as is their level of self-generated security, a term I coined myself to mean the degree to which a person can make themselves feel safe and be safe within the various situations they encounter as they go through their day, their life. That too is generally greatly decreased within depression, as is self-empowerment, the person's sense of whether they feel powerless or powerful, generally speaking, within their life and within the world. All of these and other related core aspects of emotional and psychological aspects of depression result in a compromised sense of the options available to us. For example, having no confidence in our ability to address what we perceive as addressing these directly, step by step. In these circumstances within depression, we will often conclude that it is much safer to resort to less risky solutions, such as shutting down. Why is shutting down such a favoured solution within depression? The action of shutting down immediately brings about change, or changes that are perceived, that are experienced by the person as very beneficial. Such changes, for example, can create feelings of relief, a sense of having regained control, having previously felt that things were either very out of control or were heading that way. A sense of limits being imposed on things. When we're feeling overwhelmed or perhaps approaching overwhelm, we feel like there are no limits, that everything's out of our control. The imposition of limits help us feel safer, help us feel more in control, more safe. Whatever risk or risks that we felt were impending upon us become averted, avoided, and we become more undisturbed, by which I mean shutting down often involves, as I'm discussing in a few minutes, shutting away from people so that we are either in reality more isolated, more alone, which may suit us at that time, and therefore feel less at the mercy of other people or less having to answer to other people, to talk to other people, to explain ourselves to other people, for example. Shutting down also often enables us to shut down whatever difficult emotions might either be going on within us or which might be rumbling deeper inside us, risking coming to the surface if we didn't shut them down and shut ourselves down. And importantly, overwhelm, which was either being experienced at that time or was a risk at that time, becomes averted, avoided. Disconnection occurs, which, linked in with the undisturbed bit I mentioned earlier on, that disconnect may feel very welcome at that time. These desired outcomes that follow shutting down occur quickly, consistently. In other words, they happen pretty much every time a person struggling with depression employs them. Therefore, the act of shutting down becomes a trusted solution for a person who doesn't have much trust in their ability to come up with solutions. Because that's what happens in depression, as you probably well know. The act of shutting down, therefore, delivers virtually every time. No wonder people struggling with depression employ it so much, so frequently. Examples of shutting down in depression. How shutting down manifests within depression. Shutting down in depression can manifest as a general ongoing sense of reduced connection with others and indeed with oneself, a common feature within depression. Shutting down and switching off when in company is a common way in which shutting down is expressed. Taken to the bed, quite a common action within depression. The practice of stopping actions when anxiety or fear or other difficult emotions are experienced. So, for example, a person who has experienced a lot of depression, a lot of pain within depression, may be hesitant to begin something. And if they do begin something and they begin to feel painful emotions, difficult emotions such as anxiety, fear, distress, sorrow, whatever, it is quite likely that they may choose to shut down in order to stop themselves feeling these difficult emotions. Isolation, withdrawing from people, withdrawing from life, which is often progressive as the years pass, is another way in which shutting down is often expressed within depression. I enlarge on many of these within my course, Understanding and Recovering from Depression. All of these things make sense, including why isolation would become progressive in relation to depression as the years pass. I mentioned a few moments ago shutting down difficult primary emotions. For example, sorrow, loss, and grief, sadness. Again, in my course, I explain what primary emotions are and secondary emotions. Sorrow, loss, and grief are primary emotions. Anxiety is in fact a secondary emotion, and it's no coincidence that anxiety is a very common feature within depression, as I explain within the course itself. What problems are caused by the habitual shutdown that so commonly occurs within depression? Unfortunately, there are many problems. Often the person's actual issues and challenges do not get addressed, for which there are generally many adverse consequences. Many things mount up. There's much unfinished business. There's much within the person's life that doesn't get attended to. And all of this just mounts up, remains undone, unfinished, increasing stress over and over, further tempting the person into various avoidance strategies, including, of course, shutting down, since shutting down is indeed an avoidance strategy. And therefore, this pattern becomes reinforced over and over, because the more unfinished business there is, the more there is a risk of overwhelm, and the more tempting it becomes to resort over and more increasingly to shutting down. A vicious cycle occurs. What message does it give to ourselves when we habitually practice shutting down? The message we give ourselves, and this message is repeated every time we do it, is that the belief becomes ever reinforced. Every time. The belief that I can't face, I cannot address things. This belief becomes reinforced every time because I didn't address this situation. I didn't face or didn't address the hundreds, perhaps thousands of other situations, moments just like this one. Thereby reinforcing my belief that I cannot face, I cannot address things in general. Resulting in our self-perception of ourselves as powerless, as at the mercy of life, as being powerless, as there being very little we can do to improve our situation in life, being confirmed, being reinforced. Very, very painful. No wonder hopelessness and despair is such a common feature within depression, and of course, hopelessness and despair are common triggers of suicidal thoughts. The habitual employment of shutdown in depression also results in the progressive accumulation of missed possibilities in life, missed opportunities in life. We may struggle to hit what we might describe as life's milestones. What might they be? They might include a constructive transition from teenage years into adulthood, being able to follow pathways in life such as becoming an independent adult, entering relationships, carving out independence in our lives, being able to turn our life down whatever pathways we really want to. In other words, growth, fulfillment, and being able to live a life that's worth living. All of these contribute to the accumulation of great loss, sorrow, heartbreak, despair, and hopelessness, which feel impossible to resolve because we feel so powerless in the face of any such challenges as I'm describing here. Impossible to resolve other than through further shutdown, further avoidance strategies. And so the cycle continues. And so the cycle gathers pace. Very, very painful. Another difficult consequence of habitual shutdown in depression is that it becomes very difficult and often impossible to feel joy. And this is often something that is commonly expressed by people struggling with depression, that they cannot feel any joy. The habitual shutdown is a big part of why. If we're practicing regularly shutting down our painful emotions, like sorrow and grief and pain and loss, then it's pretty inevitable that we also have to shut down our connection with joy. I discuss this in considerable detail within the course itself. Joy is a primary emotion, as is sorrow, grief, loss. When we shut down the painful primary emotions, we shut down the door into all of our primary emotions. If we were to allow ourselves to feel joy, for example, then we would have to allow ourselves to feel the great pain and distress that we have experienced, and indeed to feel the overwhelm that we have been perhaps avoiding. More on this within the course itself. You may reasonably say to me, is shutting down really a choice we make? You may feel and say to me, I don't consciously decide to shut down. It just happens. I just shut down. Through the process of repetition in relation to choices we make, many of the choices, the decisions we make, require less and less conscious thought. Take driving, for example. Changing gears. When I'm seeking to explain this to clients attending me, I will often ask them if they drive a car, if they drove to our appointment. I ask them, I assume you changed gears in your car as you drove? That's providing they don't have an automatic car, of course. And generally they say, yeah, of course I did, yes. Then I ask them, do you remember changing gears? Do you remember when you changed gears? They think for a few moments and generally say, no, I don't remember any particular moment in my journey when I changed gears. And this, of course, is typical. When someone's driving a car, when someone has been driving for quite some time and has become very familiar and comfortable with driving, they don't think about changing gears. They don't remember changing gears, but they do change gears at exactly the right time. How can this happen? It happens because with repetition, the prompting to change gears happens with less and less conscious thought. Indeed, often reaching a point where little or no conscious thought is required to initiate the process of changing gears. So, while a learner driver will have to think through every step, will have to remind themselves, I need to change gears now when the engine revs become very high. And then the learner driver will have to talk their way through the gear change. I put my foot in the clutch, then I shift the gears, and then I take my foot off the clutch, conscious of every detail in the early stages of learning to drive. But with repetition, the need for that conscious awareness becomes less and less, eventually reaching a point where an experienced driver changes gears without any conscious thought. Could be talking away to a passenger, listening to the radio, whatever, and just changes gear because it's the right thing to do at a given time, making the decision to change gears without conscious thought. Many experienced drivers would say that they often daydream when they're driving. Many would acknowledge that they don't remember the detail of a trip. Say a drive to the shop, which might involve passing through some traffic lights. Do these experienced drivers remember the detail of the choices they made, say, when they were approaching a red light? No. They know what to do, they make the right decisions, with little or no conscious thought, because through repetition, their decision-making has become almost instinctive. As I mentioned, experienced drivers, changing gears in their car, always do so at the right time, without requiring conscious initiation of this action in their mind. But it is a decision, a choice, to change gears. It has to be. A similar process occurs in relation to shutting down in depression. For any individual person, the shutting down always occurs at the right time. By which I mean, the right time for that person. While there are recurring themes to shutting down, as indeed there are within depression in general, each individual may have their own particular areas where they shut down, which may not apply across the board to other people. But for each individual person, the shutting down process generally occurs at the right time, by which I mean at the time that they have deemed appropriate. And like the learner driver, this is not a coincidence. So the answer to the question is, yes, shutting down is indeed a choice made in relation to depression as a perceived solution, as I've described earlier in this presentation. Why choose shutting down so frequently if it causes such pain and such problems? Here's my best explanation for this. Take any city skyline. As you can see, and this would be typical of pretty much any skyline, there are many tall buildings. Generally, there is one building that is the tallest. In relation to our needs as human beings, a similar situation occurs. At any given time, we may have more than one need, sometimes several needs. We humans tend to meet the need that we decide is our greatest need at that time, at that moment. So yes, at any given time, we may have several needs. Our top 2 to 3 needs at any given time may conflict with each other. This is more likely in depression because in depression we tend to have major doubts about our ability and how safe it is for us to take many actions, many risks that we feel would be involved in seeking to have some of our needs met. For example, one need, one desire we might have might be, I wish I could go to the shops like everyone else. As you may well know, as you may well have experienced if you've been struggling with depression, many people struggling with depression find it very difficult to do things that most people can do without a second thought, such as, at times, going to the shops. I'm just using this as an example. You could put any other example in there that might apply to you. But for a person struggling with depression, there's often another need, another desire, which could be expressed as follows. I must not do anything that will cause me to feel very uncomfortable or overwhelmed, or that would risk me becoming overwhelmed. As I described in the previous slide, the need that we usually meet tends to be what we perceive as our most pressing, our most urgent need. In this situation, in relation to depression, this is the need which tends to be the most pressing need. The need to do everything I can to minimize the chances of me feeling or becoming overwhelmed. So, generally speaking, in relation to depression, this is likely to be our primary need, making this other need or desire, or similar related needs, desires, secondary. Important, but secondary. Not quite as important as our need to protect ourselves, our need to minimize risk-taking, because we fear the consequences of risk-taking so much. As you can imagine, and as you may well know from your own experiences in life, this is quite a dilemma. The dilemma between two conflicting needs, desires, both of which are important to us. Over time, the uncomfortable anxiety created within our minds, within our beings, by this dilemma, tends to reduce. And shutting down quickly in this process, shutting down our awareness of our options, of our second or conflicting choices, becomes a way of reducing this anxiety, the anxiety created by this dilemma. This is another purpose of shutdown, minimizing as much as possible anxiety. So, to summarize, regularly employing shutting down, if we are struggling with depression, is a coping strategy, a protective mechanism, a survival strategy, regularly seen within depression by people struggling with depression as one's best, most workable solution, or certainly one of our best and most workable solutions. This is understandable and makes sense in the circumstances. As I mentioned earlier, my starting point is always, let's first seek to make sense of people's experiences and behaviours as a starting point for recovery work. So yes, the process of habitually shutting down does indeed make sense and is understandable. But since habitually shutting down is a form of avoidance and disconnection, when practiced habitually, as it generally is in depression, this practice inevitably leads to a whole host of problems in one's world and in one's life. In this presentation, I have set out an understanding of a very common practice within depression, the habitual practice of shutting down. If you struggle with depression, I believe it's very likely that you will be very familiar with this process of shutting down. I hope that you got something from this presentation, perhaps that you didn't understand about shutting down previously. If you found the material in this presentation helpful or useful to you, you may be interested in my course, Understanding and Recovering from Depression, from which this presentation on shutting down has been taken. Within this course, I cover and will continue to cover very important aspects of the experiences and behaviours within depression. Aspects that are often not covered elsewhere, certainly not in enough detail. The course is filled with a whole range of practical actions that people can take towards recovery, and the actions are very much following on from an enhanced and, in my opinion, much deeper understanding of the experiences and behaviours that come to be described as depression. As the saying goes, knowledge is power. The more empowered you are, the more knowledgeable you become about depression and all of the aspects of depression, the more equipped you can become to take action towards recovery. I am making this course available to you at a reduced price for a limited period of time. If you'd like to check out the course, you can click the link that you will see in the text beneath this video. Thank you for watching, and I wish you all the best.